Hello, welcome to KUASIA's webinar series. This is the final presentation talk for this semester. And today we are happy to welcome Ömer Faruk Çıngır. He is one of the KUASIA visiting scholar, and he's also a PhD candidate at the Department of Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Malaya. And his thesis is on the Indonesian and Filipino irregular immigrants in Sabah, in Borneo, and where he has conducted a series of surveys and interviews. And his main academic interests are in Southeast Asian studies, irregular migration flows, human rights and migrant workers, sociology of religion, and political sociology. And today's talk title is Irregular Migrant Workers in Southeast Asia in the COVID-19 period. Precarious and human rights violated individuals. So with that, the floor is yours, Ömer.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hello, everyone. Today I will present irregular migrant workers in Southeast Asia in the COVID-19 period, precarious and human rights violated individuals. I am Ömer Faruk Çıngır. I am a PhD student at Department of Southeast Asia Studies in the University of Malaya. And I am also visiting scholar in Koç University, and also I am working in the University of Exeter as a research development administrator. And firstly, today I will give a short background of Southeast Asia. Where is the Southeast Asia, and what is the main features of Southeast Asia? Why we are calling Southeast Asia? And then I will briefly examine the migration trends in Southeast Asia and related policies of host countries and difficulties and problems of migrants in the context of human rights-based approach and general effect of COVID-19 in the region, and how the migrants actually replied these difficulties. I will conclude with my opinions. Yeah. Firstly, I intentionally use this to examine Southeast Asia because I think these maps it's very express beautifully and greatly. Former studies on Southeast Asia, the always emphasis was made on two neighboring countries, one of India and one of China, and these two great civilizations greatly affected the Southeast Asia, culturally, sociologically, historically, and politically also. And every Southeast Asian countries has Chinese minorities. And also we can see Indian beliefs in Southeast Asia, Hinduism and Buddhism, and Buddhism especially, it's very strong in the region. And it affected the naming in the region. Different British, French, Indian experts have used different definitions, such as Other India for Southeast Asia, or Greater India, or Outer India, or Hindu states, Indianized states, describe the region. And also Chinese experts used the definition for Little China. And also French scholars always used Indochina for between India and China region. And geographers, on the other hand, defined the region Indo-Pacific. So also the nearly the 5th century, it was the golden lands for Indian scholars. Many different namings for the region. Now we are using Southeast Asia. The main reason of we are using the Southeast Asia, actually it's coming from the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. These organizations and also the colonial struggle, these countries also prefer to use Southeast Asia nations because these region, the culture is very similar with each others. Also, it's very different, but also it is very similar. And these nomenclatures derive not only from geographic location, but also from the fact that India and China, the most important cultural, social, economic, and religious shapers in the region. And these two great civilizations have shaped the daily cultural life habits and political culture, democracy, human rights transformations in the region. Apart from India and China, Sri Lankan Buddhist monks, Chinese pilgrims, Muslim traders, Western colonialism seriously affected the region. And the region of Southeast Asia geographically divided the two regions. The mainland, you can see the Indochina region, and the archipelago, Indochina Peninsula and Malay Peninsula, and the Malay Archipelago, which extends to Australia. You can see the map. And the archipelago region, known as the Sunda Islands, includes Indonesia, Philippines, and Malaysia, especially Borneo. Also, when I was collecting the data in my PhD, I was in Borneo, in Sabah, the north part of the Borneo. In the Borneo Island, have three countries, Kalimantan of Indonesia, and Malaysia, Sabah and Sarawak, and Brunei Darussalam. And also the Timor-Leste, other archipelago country, and Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia. And when we look at the peninsula, we can see Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Burma. And all these countries are Southeast Asia countries. And the Southeast Asia region has witnessed intense growth of migrant populations since the 19th century. After the 1840 Anti-Slavery Convention raised the importance of labor needs, and many migration flows then took place in the region. After the 1960s, many countries transformed significantly, and shifting from focus on agriculture to industrial production with massive inflows of foreign direct investment and trade, and relatively more liberal developed countries, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, and Philippines. They are the pioneers of Association of Southeast Asian Nations, encouraged industrial developments and tended to favor labor-intensive manufacturing. And also, in contrast, the Mekong River Delta countries, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, these investments triggered massive migration flows, while the migrants in the Mekong River Delta countries flowed into Thailand, and other Philippines and Indonesians migrants flowed Malaysia and Singapore, and also Brunei Darussalam. Also, when we talk about the Southeast Asia, some important scholars, historians like Sardasai, Damodar Sardasai, criticized always the focus was in the colonization period and colonial struggles. Colonization period is very important, but also we should look at the regional socio-economic culture, because these Asian values and the supremacy of state sovereignty and transformative power of regional and local rights movements are quite different from the rest of the world. So comparing the marginalized groups in Southeast Asia with marginalized and minority groups in the West may not give us accurate results. It is necessary to use concepts very carefully especially in examining states with different colonial pasts, state forms, social norms. The acceptance of Western social science concepts without considering local contexts are often misleading due to mistaken basing assumptions, abstractions, data interpretation, and etc. Some Asian and Western scholars have recognized this problem and emphasized the need for an autonomous social science tradition, especially in the Malaysian scholar, Said Hussein Alatas, named The Captive Mind and autonomous social science tradition. It's very important, also important, I think, for Turkey, and it enabled to criticize the Eurocentric view, and actually it encouraged the autonomous knowledge tradition. So in Southeast Asia, the concept of human rights also suggests a different specialty. It is necessary to highlight three important propositions. First, Asian values. Asian values in terms of unique social norms, ethical values, beliefs, and mentalities. And also, we should mention about this, Asian values always using excuse for ignoring human rights, especially for important political figures in the Southeast Asia, like Mahathir Mohamad, former Malaysian Prime Minister, and Lee Kuan Yew, former Singapore Prime Minister, always used Asian values. It's a kind of excuse for ignoring human rights. But also Asian values is quite important for the region, and we always consider the Asian values when we talk about the human rights and Southeast Asia. The second one, the supremacy of state sovereignty. State has absolute sovereignty in the region. Also, if we study the comparative politics, always to focus the state sovereignty and state power in the region. So we always consider this. And the third one, the transformative power of regional or local right movements. In Southeast Asia, human rights have often been viewed as secondary or negligible, clearly observed in the international agreements to which its states are party to. Many Southeast Asian countries are not party the International Labor Organization conventions and also other important international conventions. The generally migration legal frameworks regulated by memorandum of understandings, bilateral relations. International cooperation is quite weak in the region. And also human rights, it's a kind of obstacle to economic interest and always disregarded. However, these views couldn't stop the regional or local right movements. In Southeast Asia, variety of socio-economic status, anti-colonial struggles, nation-building process, ethnic diversity, governance and elite formations, and civil society organizations and institutional regimes are quite different each other. And this situation deeply affects its widespread and normalized the intra-regional migration flows, especially since migrant workers from Association of Southeast Asian Nations, member states can access more social and economic opportunities than non-Asian migrants. According to United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, more than 20 million ASEAN citizens live abroad, and nearly 7 million of them elsewhere within the region, and are important subject of research, and both in terms of their dense populations and their experiences. After the 1980s, export-oriented growth has made Southeast Asian countries more dependent on migrant workers, although their living conditions have not improved relative to this increasing dependency. Currently, the rights of migrants in host countries and the implementation of these rights are great importance in the region. So migrant workers in Southeast Asia are also among the most vulnerable and marginalized populations, particularly since economic development is prioritized over human rights, compounded by ASEAN's main principle, non-interference, also we say ASEAN way. So this non-interference principle actually holds the regional migration governance and regional governance frameworks effectively. So this has weakened regional cooperation on human rights and also which are left as states' internal responsibilities. Therefore, human rights issues related to migrants need to be carefully monitored, especially given that they were exposed to many human rights violations during the COVID-19 pandemic. Policies are implemented by states against migrant workers have become overly discriminatory, particularly since undocumented migrants can be easily arrested, deported, or disciplined. They also mostly work in sectors such as agriculture, construction, manufacturing, and domestic service characterized by lower social protection. According to official rhetoric, undocumented migrants as a vogue and mobile population could pose serious public health hazards. Thus, the measures taken have stigmatized and marginalized them. So when we look at the migration numbers, all the Southeast Asian nations have great number of migrants, especially the Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam is a great migrant sender countries, labor exporting countries. So also when we look at the next one, we can see this. The Malaysia, Thailand, and Singapore constitute the destination for 91% of intra-ASEAN migrant workers. There are clear demographic trends. Singapore mostly hosts Filipino, Bangladeshi, and Indonesian workers. Malaysia mostly hosts Bangladeshi, Nepali, and Bangladesh and Nepal are not ASEAN countries. They are South Asian countries, but also we can see amazing number of migrant workers in Malaysia, Bangladeshi, and Nepali. Bangladeshi, Nepali, Indonesian, and the fourth, the Indian, also Indian migrant workers, the third ranked in terms of migrant numbers in Malaysia, and the fifth, the Filipino migrant workers in Malaysia. And Thailand mostly hosts migrants from Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos. And these countries also the neighbors of Thailand. So geographical proximity is very important. And also the porous and permeable borders causes the impossible to manage and to hold these migration flows in the region. Also, migrants already encounter various human rights violations and repression in their home countries, also suffer marginalization and violations of their rights in host countries. Therefore, this presentation focus more situation of most important host countries in Southeast Asia, and these countries are Malaysia, Thailand, and Singapore, and also Brunei. But I don't focus the Singapore and Brunei because the Singapore is a small and super security country, and it doesn't permit the irregular migrants, undocumented migrants in Singapore. And also we cannot talk about the irregular migrants for Brunei Darussalam. So I will focus more Malaysia and Thailand. So we can ask, Why does migrant flows always exist in the region? In terms of migrants, minimum wage differences is very important pull factor for migrants. Also in migration theories, migration literature, we use many different theories, and one of the most common one, push and pull factors. And yeah, when we look at the push and pull factors for migrant workers, the minimum wage differences is very important, because when we compare the minimum wage in Indonesia and Malaysia, mostly Indonesians prefer to work in Malaysia because it's quite higher than Indonesia in minimum wage. And also similar situation in Thailand for Laotian, Cambodian, and Burmese workers. So it's very important economic factors for migrants. And in terms of host countries, actually it's enabled to fulfill labor shortage, because in Malaysia and also in Thailand, in Singapore, they are demanding agreed labor force, because they have permanent labor shortage problems in these countries. Also, domestic populations in these countries, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore, their citizens don't prefer to work these irregular migrants or migrant workers jobs. Also, we call them 3D jobs, dirty, dangerous, and difficult jobs, and also demeaning some of them, the claims. It's very difficult jobs, especially labor-intensive jobs. For example, for Malaysia, the palm oil plantations, it's very difficult. And also in service sectors, it's very difficult, very long hours jobs. And generally, domestic populations don't prefer to work. And the host countries fulfill especially for irregular migrants, these labor shortage. And for home countries, for example, Philippines and Indonesia, the remittance are quite important, especially for Philippines. Nearly 17% of economy consists of these remittances. It's one of the amazing migrant sender country all over the world, especially in Canada, in the USA, also in Saudi Arabia, in the also Middle East. Many Filipino migrant workers works, and their remittance is quite important for Philippines and also Indonesia, and also for Burmese, Laotian, and Cambodian migrant workers and their countries. And also the governments of the home countries, they can alleviate the unemployment pressures, because also this country, especially for Philippines and also Indonesia, unemployment is very important problem, and they can alleviate these migration flows. However, when we look at the quality of life of migrants, has not been enhanced in parallel with increasing dependency by the receiving states, exposed to many human rights violations because of a lack of suitable framework. Also, the United Nations and other intergovernmental and regional organizations play an important role to protecting and disseminating the idea of human rights. But regionally, when we consider the Southeast Asia, states have been reluctant to implement such norms and regional human rights mechanisms. The Asian Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights are inadequate and inefficient in the region. Also, you can see Malaysia has very permeable and porous border. Also, I would like to share one of my experiences when I was collecting the data in Sabah. Also, I was in Tawau, Sandakan, these cities. it was Eid al-Adha, and many migrants, Filipino irregular migrants, they returned to Philippines. And I asked how, and they said if you have that time it was 50 ringgit, now it equals 150 Turkish liras. If you have, we can also migrate to you. We can help you. The migration flows is very normal phenomenon in this region, and also very difficult to patrolling and halting these irregular migration flows. Also, according to Sydney law, after the Mexican-American border, the second ranked, the highly populated irregular migration flows between Malaysia and Indonesia border. So halting the irregular migration in this region, it's very difficult. Also, but when we look at the Malaysia and Thailand, the immigration policies, its major differences caused by geography, economic size, and social protection systems, and hence human rights violations vary accordingly. Malaysian social security systems cover only documented regular migrants, thus excluding undocumented migrants and even many groups of regular migrants. Social protection of migrants in Thailand varies according to status. Regardless, Thailand is the only country in the region which has most comprehensively implemented the International Labour Organization 9 classical social protection systems for migrant workers. When we look at the Malaysia, according to Graham Hugo, he was one of the important scholar, one of the greatest scholar for migration studies in Southeast Asia. It is nearly impossible to obtain clear statistics on migration movements in Southeast Asia, because it's very common and very normalized thing in Southeast Asia. When we look at the official numbers, Malaysia Ministry of Human Resources claimed more than 2 million registered migrants lived in Malaysia in 2019, far less than its estimated 1 to 3.5 million undocumented migrant workers. It's also very discussion topic, how much the irregular migrants in Malaysia. According to World Bank estimation, also in 2019, they claimed that nearly 1.9 million irregular migrants live in Malaysia. But we don't know this certain number, also the nature of the irregular migration, but the numbers between 1 million to 3.5 million. When we look at the short history of migration policy, until 1994, Malaysian government encouraged and also implemented the relatively liberal immigration policy. Foreign workers were directed from agriculture to manufacturing or operational work, and huge investments in infrastructure and construction required a mass labor force for Malaysia. The immigrant inflow halted with the Asian financial crisis in 1997, when the government implemented the restrictive policies against undocumented migrants. After the 1995, the migration policy changed and government targeted the new development goals, and also the government aimed to decrease the dependency of migrant laborers. But actually, it is not beneficial for Malaysia economy and also for migrants because the 1997 Immigration Act restricted immigration regulations and increased penalties for undocumented migrants, including imprisonment for 5 years and up to 6 strokes of the cane. It's also very interesting case. Still, the punitive, this kind of punitive mechanism is still active in the Southeast Asia, and it's very bad in terms of human rights. So by law, when we look at the regular migration framework, irregular migrants constitute those entering country without official permits, those with expired or cancelled visa but remain in country, refugees, asylum seekers, and also many other definitions for irregular migrants. So one of the biggest problem for Malaysia, irregular migrants definition is vague and quite wide in Malaysia. And also governments, it's a kind of implements, I summarize with ACE, adjustments, controlling and elimination strategies on irregular migrants. How? For example, adjustment strategy, it's a legal frameworks. It's a kind of securitization of legal frameworks and sending them in it's a kind of prison and the controlling their sandbag and elimination process, and it's a kind of biopolitics of migrant workers, we can say, and it's quite common in Malaysia. The amnesty operations and also repatriation, deportation is quite common in Malaysia. So we can say elimination for deportation and the sent back to migrants. Also, we solve these cases in the COVID-19 period. COVID-19 period in Malaysia. And also, I would like to actually define the irregular migrants definitions according to Kasım, Azize Kasım, one of the important scholar. She describes the irregular migrations in Malaysia, foreign nationals who came clandestinely without any travel documents, children born to foreign nationals in Malaysia whose births have not been officially documented, foreign workers whose work passes have expired, pass abusers and contract defaulters, overstayers who may or may not be in workforce, foreign nationals in possession of false documents or holding genuine documents obtained fraudulently. So actually, the keyword is the contract defaulters. For example, you are coming as a regular registered migrant workers to Malaysia. But if you want to change your work, your legal status can be easily irregular. You can lose your legal status and your status can be irregular migrant. So contract defaulting is very easy. And also your employer fire the migrant workers and your status become irregular. So actually it's very vague definition, and because of this situation, we don't know how much irregular migrants live in Malaysia, and because it's very easy to becoming irregular status. It's very important problem because all international labor organization and migration governance frameworks only regulated regular ones. So irregular migration is very stigmatized and marginalized. And why migrants chooses irregular migration? Because irregular migration is easier, cheaper, and faster for migrants, and also prompted by the lack of efficient migrant worker regulations. The government deported undocumented workers and blocked the renewal of existing work permits. Amnesty programs provided undocumented migrants an opportunity to depart unpenalized. Police actions to combat irregular migration hardened, and a work permit system based on offshore recruitment was enforced. Meanwhile, detention camps were constructed to hold undocumented workers and intimidate would-be migrants. In 2004, the government planned to return more than 1 million undocumented migrants. The Ikatan Relevant Rakyat People Voluntary Corps was mobilized to support these operations and has been accused of committing many human rights violations and against irregular migrants. I also published a book chapter about the Malaysian migration framework in the Ankara University Press. If you are interested in these topics, you can look this publication. And Thailand. Modern economic development in Thailand generally accepted as beginning from 1960. The import substitution growth strategy pursued in 1960s caused structural problems, and foreign direct investment schemes became more selective. From 1981, the Thai government began to focus on export-oriented growth strategy, which required intensive production, especially for rice, and also the construction and rice plantations generally fulfilled by irregular migrants, Burmese workers especially, but the construction and also the service sectors needs migrant workers. And 1990s, many migrants came to Thailand and it arrived 1 million. As of August 2019, Thailand hosted more than 2.8 million migrant workers, and mostly from Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam. Thailand's dependency on low-skilled migrant workers has increased since the 1990s because of enhancement of exports. It also lacks a legal employment path for local workers. Laotian, Burmese, and Cambodian migrants could be employed after 1992. And even after the economic crisis of 1997, when the Thai government established a rigorous quota system, migration flows continue. And only gained limited, and there is exploitation and human rights violations. Human rights are not well developed in Thailand, considering rule by military juntas, forced disappearances, violations of freedom of speech, and torture are common abuses in Thailand. So what happened in COVID-19 in Southeast Asia? Dr. Ying Hui, she defined 6 dominant regional trends as a result of COVID-19. The first one is a rise of authoritarianism. Securitization and lack of civil rights already fundamental problems, and violations of basic human rights this period, in COVID-19 period, it increased amazingly. Also, when we look at the second one, the lack of regional solidarity. Circumstance in Southeast Asia, the regional solidarity is quite weak. And this pandemic period, the lack of regional solidarity, the weakness of regional solidarity became more, and ASEAN couldn't efficiently receive weak cooperation and solidarity. And the third trend was increasing militarism. Most of Southeast Asian countries implemented lockdown in their countries, and in this process, many countries used military. Also, we know the Myanmar faced a military junta this period. The next, the fourth is the trend is the big governance capacity, particularly those related to human rights, security, education, and work conditions is quite problematic in the region. And in COVID-19 period, also these problems, these weak governance mechanisms, also the transparency, accountability is quite weak, and it becomes more visible also in this period. And the fifth trend is rising inequalities. Also, inequality is quite high in Southeast Asia, and in COVID-19 period, also it became a normal phenomenon in the region. And this is the role of technology. I think it's very important because of the surveillance mechanisms in Southeast Asia is quite common. You cannot go to shopping without using your app and mobile tracking applications. And it is in Philippines, in Indonesia, in Thailand, in Malaysia, and Singapore. It was a norm. You can, if you want to shopping or to school, you always use, or you can only enter with using these applications. So role of technology is also very important role in the COVID-19 period in Southeast Asia. And what happened migrants in COVID-19 periods? Overall, given the main regional focus on prioritizing economic opportunities with human rights and health being secondary focus, so this mentality now posed a major challenge, particularly for migrants. In Southeast Asia, most migrants live in crowded space and that are generally inconducive for maintaining hygiene and cleanliness. This was especially so for irregular migrants working daily during the pandemic to maintain a regular revenue. Even registered migrant workers lacked the certain social security protection and were at risk of losing their legal status, thus making them vulnerable in legal terms and suffering substandard health and safety protections. In Malaysia, for instance, the economic problems caused by both the movement control order, the lockdown, and the pandemic in general were considerable for migrant workers, many of whom were arrested through the extension of state power, restrictions on freedom of the press and movement, and limited access to information. It's impossible to transparency in Southeast Asia. Also, when we look at the Malaysia case, COVID-19 exacerbated the basic human rights problems already problematic in the region, and the number of human rights violations against migrants increased. Such violations incited by states against migrant workers became more apparent, where migrants were seen as expendable and replaceable, thus not only exposing this situation, but also the weakness of existing regional governance structures. The government implemented national crackdowns and harsh punishments against irregular migrants, exercising its sovereignty via disciplinary, regulatory, and suppressive power. In the late March 2020, the senior Minister of Security, Dato Sri Ismail Sabri bin Yaqub, now current Prime Minister, that time it was Security Minister, stated that the illegal migrants should not be concerned about their status because the government had decided not to make it an issue of concern, and instead it aimed to focus on combating the pandemic, and it was very good policy. Therefore, it would provide free healthcare for all foreigners, irrespective of immigrant status during the MCO, the lockdown process. But by the end of the April, hundreds of migrant workers were detained and arrested in Kuala Lumpur and held in detention centers or special prisons. Changed its decision about the parties responsible for paying migrant workers. COVID-19 testing cost several times, eventually declaring that the Social Security Organization would do so if those migrant workers already contributed to it. So it was a problem who will pay these social protection mechanisms, these expenses, these expenditures. The government in the final said, I will pay, I will test, and also I will vaccinate free. But because of the uncertain policies, most of migrants fear, they scared to arrest and detain, and actually they stuck. I talked with many different grassroots organizations in Sabah and also in Malaysia, different NGO staff, and they said many migrants, especially irregular migrants, they stay in the house, and most of these migrants actually they are working, they are day laborers, and every day they need to go to work to earn money because they don't have a regular job. So their precarity increased sharply in this period. And also the Malaysian Official Human Rights Commission, Suhakam, noted that despite the stated amnesty, human rights violations occurred, many human rights violations occurred in Malaysia. Besides calling for arrest to end soon, Commission members also stated that detentions could even pose public health risk to public. The Minister of Human Resources suggested that if employers needed to dismiss their employees, they will terminate their foreign workers first. It's very interesting. And also it's the other interesting thing, the Thailand ministers says the same thing. If you need to dismiss their employees, you can terminate the foreign workers first. Also, when we look at the Thailand, Cambodia, and Myanmar warned migrant workers against returning home at this time, despite their desire to do so, because many lost their jobs and lacked any income or health care. The International Labour Organization in Thailand reported that migrant workers are among the first to lose their jobs as employers are downsizing their workforce. Some domestic migrant workers were fired for fear of spreading COVID-19, and some employers confiscated migrant workers' documents to keep them at work without being paid. Even migrant workers who were employed could not access masks and hand sanitizers at their workplace. Preventive information was mostly written in the Thai language, hence obstructing the dissemination of information to migrant workers. Many migrant workers have lost their jobs during the lockdowns. The Thai government allowed them to return home. The massive negative economic impacts were particularly fueled by the repatriation of migrant workers, which caused a halt in production. The government later allowed their return to Thailand. And after this process, the government allowed their return. Many migrant workers became their legal status undocumented, irregular, because the government didn't approve their new working conventions, their agreements. So their status became irregular in Thailand. It was a very big problem, especially for Burmese workers. And unpaid wages, poor living conditions, access to clean water, and masks were among the problems faced. But migrants did not have access to active complaint mechanisms or health service in Thailand. So, conclusion. Also, when we look at the 9 core human rights conventions, Malaysia only exceeded the 3 of them: children rights, women rights, rights of disabled persons, and also Singapore only ratified 4 of them, and Thailand ratified 7 of the 9 core conventions. And actually, Malaysian human rights, national human rights mechanisms, Suhakam, encouraged the adaptation of action plan to monitor the progress and implementation of human rights issues. But it's a very novel process in Southeast Asia, human rights process. Also, when we look at the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of all Migrant Workers and Members of their Families, none of Southeast Asian countries signed this convention. Also, ILO agreements containing the main norms relating to social security have not signed by most ASEAN countries, thus revealing the weak regional governance in terms of migrant workers. Access to social security has many barriers, even for registered migrant workers, while irregular migrant workers have no rights at all in their host countries, which makes them more vulnerable and subject to abuse. And irregular migrations persist regionally because of legal roadblocks to regular migration, documentation, money, and time. It's many of burdensome of the regular migration process. Actually, it causes to irregular migration flows and also geographically permeable boundaries and poor management of migration. In fact, a right-based migration governance framework benefits all parties. We always also, it's a very important case nowadays in Turkey. We should always support right-based migration governance because it also benefits all parties. Not it's for benefit, but it's also we are human being and we should always support, we always defend the human being because of we are human being. And by protecting migrants' rights and alleviating irregular migration, but irregular migration is very important case. I don't want to use problem because it's a kind of result of the policies actually. But we always should, how can we decrease the irregular migration? Because migrants themselves faces many problems. And from this viewpoint, approach to migration supported by International Labour Organization and global governance mechanisms to prevent labor shortages and ensure continuity of production should be emphasized instead of just employing a need-based approach. Also many scholars, migration scholars like Anton Pekot and other scholars criticize, I'm also criticizing in my dissertation, we always criticize, in my opinion, need-based approach. We always support right-based approach because need-based approach prioritize the economic benefits of countries, not economic benefits of migrants or peoples. Only some governments, actually corrupted governments, becoming rich. So we always defend the right-based approach. This approach actually remind us we are all human beings, and also the COVID-19 revealed the inequalities, poverty, and vulnerabilities and gaps in social security. And regardless whether one is a migrant or citizen, anyone could be potential transmitter of virus, and thus illustrating how common living spaces should be built by considering common interests through human-centered policies and approach. Thank you very much for listening my presentation. Yeah, I am waiting your questions. I am stopping the share.
Thank you very much, Ömer, for this very comprehensive and very important topic. I think you touched upon many important aspects of when thinking about migration, especially international migration. Now we're going to open up the floor to the for a Q&A, and participants can either open their microphones and ask directly, or they can write their questions in the Q&A box. So, well, okay, then let's start with Burak.
Okay, so Ömer, thanks so much for your very informative presentation on this very crucial topic. So I have a couple of questions. One, how do you see the role of business organizations in these outcomes? What did they do during the COVID-19 era about, workers' rights? To what extent can we see these policies that you are criticizing as at least partly consequence of business lobbying? And second, you're, of course, across the world, we have witnessed many lockdowns, right? But again, many of these lockdowns, with the exception of, let's say, China and a few East Asian countries, actually, many of these lockdowns were, partial, incomplete, and, mostly failed to achieve, tangible results in terms of, case drop, significant drop in case loads and so on and so forth. To what extent the lockdowns worked well in there? And to what extent during lockdowns, these, factories and other enterprises that employ these vulnerable migrant workers stayed open? So, on the one hand, right, governments declare and try to impose lockdowns. On the other hand, they open up all kinds of loopholes, right, that, existing businesses can benefit from. So to what extent you see it in your cases? Yeah, thank you.
Can I answer, or?
Yeah, it's up to you. You can answer one by one. Or...
Thank you very much, Dr. Rak. Hocam, teşekkür ederim. It's very great questions. Actually, I would like to start with the last question. I forgot to mention in the lockdown process in Malaysia, many factories continue the production, especially for rubber production. One of the important case, top gloves. I think the biggest rubber factory all over the world, and they didn't care any social protection and safety protections in the COVID-19 process, and actually they implemented forced labor. Many their workers, top glove workers, consist of migrant workers, and some of them didn't renew their became also irregular migrants, but the factory continue to production because of the COVID-19 pandemic period. Top gloves produces the medical gloves, and medical gloves and also masks is very important good for COVID-19 pandemic, and governments didn't implement any punitive or deterrent measures for this kind of top gloves and also other factories. And these companies, for example, top gloves in the COVID-19 pandemic period, expanded maybe 3 times in this period their market prices expanded, and also the company expanded and growth. So in Southeast Asia, corruption is very common, and also the lack of and accountability. Governments didn't take important measures to save and secure the migrant workers, and they continue their production, and actually it was very bad for migrant workers. And the second one, the business organizations and their lobby are quite strong in Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Singapore, and also the Thailand case. And these countries, the most hosted, most populated migrant worker countries. And actually this business lobby easily affect decision makers, policy decision makers. So in this period, the companies also prioritized their economic interests, and they continue to use irregular migrants. Also, many NGOs on human rights, they criticized the continuity of the production, but the production and the other insecure environments for migrant workers continue in the COVID-19 pandemic period in Malaysia.
Thank you, Ömer. We have a question from Dafa. You can open your microphone.
Merhabalar. Hello, Mr. Ömer. Thank you so much for the session. It's very enlightening. My name is Dafa. I'm a student in Mersin University. For the last 3 years, I've been working together with Indonesian Embassy in mitigating, tackling irregular migration precisely inside of Turkey. I have some like two questions for you.
Yeah.
The first one is, when I see the conclusions, it feels like it's heavy more on the sender countries, not on the receiving countries. Like, for example, if we analyze the receiving ends, Indonesia sent almost 1 million migrants inside of Middle East, for example, in Saudi Arabia, the most. And it feels like there's some aspect of cultural products that invited all of these migrants. So there is for an instance, a supply and demand factor, like from a cultural side. And do you think the same? Is there a cultural factor in this, or in another perspective? I've read some part written by Rachel Parenas, a Philippine expert on migration of workers. She said that the cultural aspect only be seen from Orientalist perspective. Only Orientalists sees this. There is only an absence of law, especially in the Middle East, that invites the chaos as we've seen right now. Do you agree with these notions, like Parana said? And the second question is, when we were working with the embassy, we feel like there's a surge of incoming Indonesian migrant inside of Turkey. This is a new phenomenon we've seen, because the Syrian migrants are coming also inside of Turkey, and Arabs are commonly known for hiring Indonesian maids, and Syrians today are start to hiring Indonesians, and mostly in irregular ways, like they never reported to the Gochidarasi, to the local officials, and it's always using the tourist visas. And especially today, since there is a free visa policy decided by the Turkish government, Indonesian government, especially the embassies, are afraid there is more and more approaching incoming migrants, workers that is coming from a irregular way. What is your opinion on this? Like, as an expert or as a student in migration policies? That's my questions to.
Migration policies of Turkey?
Yes, because Turkey right now has set a free visa policy towards Indonesia. So there's more and more coming Indonesians to Turkey, and especially there's Syrian migrants. They like to hire some maids, like the older Middle Easterners always do, and we fear there's increasing irregular migrants inside of Turkey because of that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, now we are also started the last one. Turkey migration strategy was, in my opinion, slightly wrong. Also, when I was in master degree in Turkey, 2015 and 2016, I cannot study these Syrian refugees because the Ministry of Internal Affairs didn't allow to study the Syrian refugee. They allow the end of the 2016. Also, transparency is a very big problem. And now we are accessing some documents about the migration. Yeah, Yabancılar ve Uluslararası Koruma Kanunu, the Foreigners and the International Protection Law was a very good, and actually they implemented as a covered by international protection mechanisms. But we always look at the current situation. These legal frameworks did not appropriate for current situation. also that period, it was appropriate. And many actually scholars criticized, but and also the migrants used as a different strategies for the European Union and also the decision makers. So the Turkey migration framework actually it was not comprehensive policy. It was the temporary. Also the for example, the notion was the temporary protection. It was temporary because they thought they will return. But if you study the migration studies, you should know 80% they will not return. All over the world, they are not returning. So it should be stable and adaptation and integration policy. But also this adaptation and integration policy should be human-centered and shouldn't be centered of the economic benefits. For example, in Turkey, still different ministries and also different businessmen claims that we need to Syrian, Afghani, Pakistani, and Iraqi conditional refugees and irregular migrants. We really need to this kind of labor force because we need cheap labor. It is very unethical thing, and no one said it is unethical. So it's the problems. It's more cultural. It's more moral. It's more also political. For example, Ansar and Muhajir, they are brother because of the Islamic belief. Also, it's one of the different notion. But we don't have an environment we can criticize these things rationally, and how can we implement more human-centered, and also it not prioritize the only migrants. It's also it should prioritize the domestic people of Turkey. For example, I studied in Sabah. I love Sabahan people, amazing people in Borneo. When I interviewed some experts, they always criticizing the migration policies in Malaysia, also in Sabah policies also different from the Malaysian governments. They said government didn't prioritize the people of Sabah, only prioritize their benefit, not also the benefit of migrants. The similar situation actually generalized. Yeah, all generalization has a potential problematic, but we can generalize actually to Turkey case. The government didn't prioritize the migrants' benefits or the people's of the domestic people's benefits. Only benefits their future political desires. So because of this reason, it's very problematic. It's very big question. I cannot answer. I hope we can discuss the different time. We can discuss this. Yeah, but it's a problematic. Also, I would like to add this. Many migration scholars in Turkey, they always supported from European migration frameworks. I think it's also be problematic. We should criticize also the Western mentality, and also we should think the autonomous. I am not talking about the new Ottomanist desire. I'm talking about can we produce a more autonomous, more rational migration management framework we can. Actually, we should discuss. It's very important topic, I think. And in Turkey, when I look to Malaysia and also from Southeast Asia, I don't see too much our autonomous, our policy, our strategy. Only the different strategy we always implementing. It's also another important case. Cultural view. Actually, international labor organizations frameworks, the migration governance frameworks prioritize the need-based approach. Yeah, international labor organizations doing amazing job, but when we compare the last 50 years, the inequalities amazingly increased. So also we should discuss the international labor organizations and the general migration governance frameworks, good governance frameworks, for example, United Nations good governance frameworks, and also World Bank's also supported good governance frameworks. Also, when I was collecting the data, many migrants, irregular migrants in Sabah, they said some reporters from United Nations, and they took some photo, and then they returned and they wrote many reports about the irregular migrants, but they said they didn't had not too much, a little bit, they didn't help us. So why they came and they took the photo? So it is the gap, actually, these kind of big organizations, and also they create a great discourse. Also, Andrew Geddes criticized this last year. He wrote a book about this. They create amazing knowledge, amazing discourse on, but when we look at the field, we can see the of these reports actually. So yeah, I totally agree, the Orientalist view. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ömer Hocam. Probably if I can ask last questions, who do you quote in your works, like the migration policy thinkers frequently? Like, who do you recite from? I'm curious about that. Thank you. This is the last one.
Amarjit Kaur, and also I love to read the Say to Hüseyin Alataş, and also it's more related to captive minds and autonomous social knowledge. But in migration, Graham Hugo, also one of my supervisor, he is Dr. Said Mahadi. He's one of the last supervisee of Graham Hugo when he was in Adelaide in Australia. And Graham Hugo was amazing, and also Aziza Kasım in Malaysia. And also I say the young Andika Wahab, especially amazing scholar from UKM University Kebangsaan Malaya, and Chu Chin Lo, Evelyn Devedoson, also from University of Malaya. It's amazing scholars for the migration studies in Southeast Asia.
All right, thank you, Ömer. We have a question in the Q&A box from Ingrid, and it might be related to what you maybe just answered now in terms of the Orientalist framework. But she asks, during COVID-19, we have seen a change in the human rights framework and how this concept is understood in the Western world. So as you said, Southeast Asia never agreed on it, and it is understandable taking into account the fact that they consider society relying on community, not the individual. Therefore, how can we analyze the policies implemented for what regards migrant workers as well in a comparative manner?
Wow, it's very difficult question and very good question. Actually, it's a gap. We can think about this. In the human rights in Asia is quite different from the West. But actually, many scholars, and also I am not excluding myself this, we are always using the concepts of the Western concepts and Western mentality. Actually, we cannot using the original Eastern idea, Eastern mentality. Also, we cannot consider too much to also Asian values, Confucianism, Mahayana Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism. We always consider this, but it's a kind of the knowledge on it's a great academia discourse, and we are using this Western discourse. For example, the Januar asked who are citing. I need to cite. For example, I get a review from a very important journal. They said you didn't cite important Western American scholar in your article, so you should cite. If you not cite, you cannot publish very important essays, social science citation index journal. Perspectives on Politics, for example. It was journal. So it's very impossible. It's very difficult to actually to get also to study from Eastern to study to Eastern mentality, because it's in our cell. It's our mentality. It's our mind, our rationality. So also human rights perspective is not different. That how can we analyze? Actually, it's amazing question. I will think this. I am also thinking on this, but yeah, I will continue to think about this question. It's very good question. Actually, it's very difficult. If you offer a new approach, also we can discuss. I'm open to read and to discuss new perspectives, especially from Eastern perspective. Yeah, it will be great. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you. And actually, this reminded me of this limit of the Western human rights framework, with this example of this anti-human trafficking law that the United States passed, I think in like the year 2000, and that sort of imposes all, well, sort of demands all the other nations to follow the anti-trafficking protocol established by the US Congress, which itself seems like a good human rights framework, but in reality, especially for migrants from the Philippines related to sex workers, it has put these workers more in a marginalized position, because they are essentially barred from international migration to certain countries, because they are classified as victims of human trafficking. So the US framework, whether or not it's the intentions are good or not, but it, without really taking into account the local circumstances,
Yeah.
and it actually might put these workers in an even more marginalized and precarious position. And I also have one quick question about the COVID restrictions. When thinking of COVID restrictions, how about the border restrictions? How was the situation in Southeast Asia? Like, were these international migrant workers able to enter or exit the country, especially during the height of the pandemic? Because I've been hearing a lot of news for migrants, especially from Southeast Asia, especially like from Vietnam, trying to enter Japan as a temporary worker on a visa program, but because of since the pandemic happened and with the strict border restriction in Japan, the ones that were already in Japan were stuck, and the ones that were planning to go could not go. So that really, I think, changed the plans of these future careers of these workers. So I wonder what the situation was among the Southeast Asian countries in terms of the border restrictions.
Thank you, Doctor. Also, it's very good question. Border restrictions was very hard. And for example, in Malaysia, dependent, your wife, your children cannot enter the country in Malaysia. And also the Malaysia implemented maybe one of the longest movement control order lockdown all over the world. Nearly 2 years, you can only go to shopping and pharmacy. That's all. It was very, very bad situation. And the many migrants at this 2020, many migrant workers, if they are working in Malaysia, they cannot go to their country. And also the Malaysia government allow to renew their agreements. First, they didn't allow, then they allow. And also migrant workers also stuck in the Malaysia. It's very similar situation in Thailand. Thailand government first didn't allow, then they allow, and many Burmese and Laotian and Cambodian workers returned to country. And after 6 months, the Thailand government declared these migrant workers they can accept again, but at this period, the legal procedures was very problematic, and many migrant workers, especially Burmese workers, couldn't get a registered migrant workers. They become irregular migrant workers. Especially the first 6 months, it was very strict restriction on border management. But after the 6 months, some countries, especially Thailand and also in other countries, a little bit, they lose these restrictions. But Malaysia, it was always very strict border restrictions. And also Singapore implemented very strict restriction. Also, for example, in Singapore, a very different case, more than 95% of the COVID cases consist of migrant workers. And if you enter the Ministry of Labor of Singapore, you can see the local domestic Singapore citizen COVID numbers and the migrant workers. And always, for example, ministry declared we over the COVID and we ended the restriction. He implied to only domestic population. Other restriction and other all measures continue for Singapore, for migrant workers in Singapore. So Yeah. So I cannot speak. I find quite odd and ironic to get questions. Yes, others understand the yeah, I hope it can change, but yeah, we need to produce more academic debates and academic papers from Eastern perspective, because Western perspective already have amazing literature, and actually most of us, we can access and we know the Western perspective, but the Eastern perspective is quite new and quite novel and actually quite amazing. Yeah, we need to develop this. Yeah, sorry, doctor. Yeah, border restrictions, it was very hard, very strict in the COVID-19 period. Many countries, so actually many migrant workers suffered from these strict policies. And but I think after 1 year, many countries lose the restriction.
All right, thank you very much, Ömer. So we are out of time right now. So if there's no pressing questions to add, I would like.
I guess there is one question in the Q&A box.
Is there? I think we answered Ingrid's question.
Yeah, Ingrid.
Okay.
Okay, so then let's end the webinar here. Thank you, Ömer, again. It was a very important and interesting topic, and thank you for the participants for all this engaging questions, and I'm very happy to hear this wonderful discussion in this webinar. So thank you again, and have a nice day or evening or wherever you are.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. Bye.
Thank you.